We are here with Patrick McCorkle, and we thank him for his time. Patrick is a poet from Oshkosh, and I'm very, very happy to be interviewing him. We've had such a great variety of poets on the program. Patrick, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, I just take such, as you can tell, I take such pride in this program. Tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you become interested in poetry, or maybe just give a quick bio of yourself, as we say in the business?
Yeah, no, I mean, I like to say born and raised in the 54901, born in Oshkosh and the old Mercy Hospital that's now, I believe, like a retirement community.
Yep.
Fun fact, my sister and I were born in rooms adjacent to each other, like 7.5 years apart.
Oh, cool.
But otherwise, I've lived a bit in Butamore, some a little bit in Appleton, but and then a year in Mexico teaching English, but otherwise, been in Oshkosh most of my life. I think I was both my grandparents were professors, so they were from an early age. There was a lot of emphasis on learning and education. My father and mother also were always about school and grades, taking me to the library. So I developed a lot of book reading habits early, and I think in regards to poetry, the first thing that caught my eye was more probably the epic poems, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, something like that, and maybe middle school, high school age, like I really like that epic form of poetry. Lord of the Rings has a lot of, like the ring verse and some of the songs / poems that Tolkien writes. So very much first off, I think the epic tradition, often, it has rhymes or it's meant to be sort of performative. I think then after that, when I was like in American literature classes, there was some, I remember, my Papa's Waltz, that was around the time, I think, of the early 20th century. There's some, Robert Frost, the one that everybody gives, The Road Not Taken. There's a variety. So, like, my American literature classes were interesting. And I think that as of late, I drifted away for a while from epic poems and that sort of thing. But then I came back to it because I'm writing a fantasy novel and I have to write, and I write my own, shouldn't say I have to, I like to write my own verses or rhymes or poems for that. There's also a YouTube channel. It's maybe a younger person's thing, but it's called Songify the News, where they often these YouTubers take the news and make people like rhyme and sing. And I often think a lot of poetry, there, like the rhyming sort of that musical quality to it. There's that division of poetry that does rhyme. So I think those types of things, or epic rap battles. I think a strong connection between rap and poetry. So like I like epic rap battles of history where they have historical figures sort of rap each other. I mean, it's performative, but there is that element. Everything rhymes. It's very succinct. So I think, yeah, there's a variety of interests, but ultimately I think epic poems, sometimes the contemplative Robert Frost type things, but there's a variety of avenues, how I get my poetry, if you will.
Yeah, excellently stated all the way around. We can't let you go without, doing that poem to start us off with. This is something I got, actually, I stole this idea from Jeremy Jusick, who is the Parma, Ohio poet laureate. And he has such an excellent show, and I was honored. He was one of our first guests on the show, but he always starts his show off with a poem. So could you bless us with a poem here?
Yeah, so I'll do kind of a lighter fare, because some of the news lately has been a little bit rough. This poem's inspired by that whole negotiations over how much funding are we going to give the Brewers for their stadium. And it can apply, I think, to a lot of different sports teams, but it's titled "Take Me Out to My New Stadium." So
Awesome.
Mark was baseball mad, had the fever, and had it bad. He brought the Brewers in '04, giving Bud Selig a nice score. In '23, rough was American Family Field, so to the politicians Mark appealed. His friend Robin asked, "Would you like some money?" Mark replied, "Yes, I'll tell you what to do, honey." Mark wanted to cover all 162 games without knowing all the taxpayer names. Told the public they would be wrong if they didn't pass their money along. To make them come through, Mark knew what he had to do to cheer up the owners he knew. He sang this song until his face was blue. Take me out, Milwaukee. Take me out, Madison. Buy me some upgrades and repairs. I don't care how the state budget fares. It's fun, 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 my stadium. If you don't, it's a shame. For it's 1, 2, 3 subsidies, then you're out of the old stadium game. So,
Poem with some music in it too. That's
yeah.
And as you talked about, the performative is a beautiful thing. There's always this performative element of poetry, and I don't think I've caught fire with that yet, but I might. Who knows?
Yeah, because a lot of the epic poet, like you think about it, Homer or the Bard tradition, they were reading the Iliad and the Odyssey out loud. It was very much a experience, for the audience and the reader. Yeah. And in that poem I just made, it's because I was looking up the "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." Like a lot of the part that we read at or sing at baseball games is only the third verse. The first two verses are about a woman trying to get her boyfriend to take her to the ball game. So it's like it's it's sort of segue. A lot of times when I'm writing these poems, especially if they're satirical, like that one was, or educational, I find myself doing research and I never knew that there was two other verses to take me out to the ball game. So, but yeah, the performative aspect, I think, especially with satire, I think enhances it because it's just like, how much money are we going to give these guys? Like, how much money do they need? But I think I agree. There's I guess there's poetry, like look at novels. You have sci-fi, you have fantasy, you have romance. Like, yes, they're all roughly delivered in the same form, but they're very different from each other. I mean, you have groups that won't read one or other, or it's I'm in a couple of writing groups now where it's like people are they like their genres and they usually stay in them. So I think with poetry, it's like there's a performative and there's the non-performative, and it sometimes seems like those two camps clash more with each other than with other genres. But
yeah, I first met you at one of the great poetry open mics in Oshkosh.
Yes.
Now they're being held at the New Moon, and you have an interesting mix there too of more performative people, and then more straight ahead people like me. But it's kind of a cool mix of people, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a lot of variety. There's a lot of it's like going. Yeah, anytime I go to a critique group or those poetry readings, it's stuff that I don't know if I would have come across it another way.
Yeah, and Oshkosh Poet Laureate Tom Cannon deserves a lot of credit for that. He's really trying hard to, and that's something I'm trying to do as North Fond du Lac Poet Laureate, getting some things going here. So let's talk a bit about your approach to the writing process. How do you, and this may seem like an overgeneral question maybe, but how do you generate ideas, and where does the inspiration come for your work most of the time?
I think what I try to do, I remember Ray Bradbury, who's obviously more of a short story novelist, but he gave the advice to the effect of, before you go to bed, always read diverse pieces. Like, try to read something nonfiction, something persuasive, something, as much stuff put in your head as possible. So I guess when it comes to poetry, a lot of times it's just, I'm trying to grab onto anything I encounter or read or do. Again, referencing Tom Cannon, he at the Lake Fly Writers Conference, that it comes every spring in Oshkosh. He said, let's do a poem about color. That's it. It's a color. And then I was like, okay, let me really focus on, and I chose purple because it's the color of royalty. I was really involved in my fantasy novel. So then I wrote like a poem that is, just about the color purple. What does it mean? What does it signify? So a lot of times the impetus or the inspiration, if you're open to it, is everywhere. You could write a piece of, obviously, about the tragic events, have all over the globe. I mean, there's no shortage of them. You have the Libyan floods, you have Gaza, you have Ukraine, you have here the shooting in Maine. I mean, there's a lot of, heart-wrenching stuff, but there's also encouraging things like trick-or-treating. You could write a nice little poem about that. So I guess for the inspiration part, I try to, with Ray Bradbury's idea, not only do I try to consume as different, sources of information, but also like what is happening in front of me? What do I see? What is going on? What is Tom brought up that topic about color. I never really thought about writing a poem about color before, but it was a very worthwhile experience. So I think, it's a variety, both those things, both consuming like literary or other, written material, as well as just kind of keeping the senses open to what's around you.
Yeah. By the way, you and I have something more in common. Our
Mm.
hometowns are Oshkosh, basically.
Oh,
I actually was born in Colorado,
oh,
but since the age of like 9, I lived in Oshkosh, so I count that as my hometown.
yeah, yeah.
Grew up sailing on the lake, totally spoiled. Didn't realize
Hmm.
how good I had it, you know. But how is I had this question kind of came up here. How has living in Oshkosh influenced your poetry or writing in general?
I think definitely. I think Oshkosh is that nice blend of it's that mid-sized city where you still can get a fair amount of nature in it. Like Menominee Park, I go multiple times a week, and there's
Mm-hmm.
you can watch the geese, or you can watch just the water, or so there's a lot of I think having that
Mm-hmm.
proximity towards like I live on the north side, very close to Menominee Park, and there's not there you can go at right times. There's not a lot of activity. It's
Mm-hmm.
quiet. It's sort of serene, like a sort of Walden Pond type experience. So I think that the nature that's present in the city is helpful because you can go to I guess it's true too. You go to like New York and there's Central Park and stuff, but there's so much noise, there's so much activity. Oshkosh kind of slows down. Like right now in my neighborhood, there's nothing. There's not really. You hear a car speeding by, but otherwise it's quiet.
Mm-hmm.
People are. It's dark. It slows down and allows you to think. So I
Mm-hmm.
think, or Oshkosh, that combination of nature and the city, gets you more contemplative. It's not always just go go go, do this, do this, do this. Or maybe in some other, when I was in Mexico, it was close to Mexico City, and it was just people were just always doing stuff. They're always moving. There really isn't any time to slow down.
Mm-hmm.
I would say also the library, the Oshkosh Public Library, because that was a formative part of my upbringing. My dad bringing me in there when I was very young, so
Mm-hmm.
like the writing group, the Saturday group. That's where I first met Tom Cannon. So that the having just this is maybe I should write a poem about this, or somebody else wrote a poem about a parent or something, and that exchange of ideas. So I guess those are the two main sources. Probably the Oshkosh got that nice kind of blend of city and nature, and the
Mm-hmm.
library, and to some extent the university where I went. I went to UWO. So
Excellent. Yeah, I would have to say, growing up on the lake, and I've actually
mm-hmm.
written 3 poems/songs about sailing with my father. That was a
Oh,
huge
okay.
theme when I used to crew on his scow. It was a racing scow,
Oh, okay.
and
Cool.
so that led to some poetry and song. One of
Naturally,
the
yeah.
songs called "Sailing Away," and yeah. Anyway, yeah, great. Oshkosh is a friendly city, I think, very
Mm-hmm.
friendly, and it's got a good diversity of people, a good culture.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't have had a better place to grow up. It's wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
What about what are there? Let's shift here. Are there? You said that when you go to bed at night, you try to sort of ingest some of the greatest writing. What poets and writers are your go? Do you have like a go-to poet that or a go-to writer where it really fills your needs of reading? And how do you have favorites like that?
Yeah, I'd say like Tolkien is really up there because what he did for the fantasy genre, and he was so steeped like in the classical literature, and like he had so much knowledge that he could impart. I mean, the Ring verse I read periodically, because it gets that sense. You get it's so great at like in a small time frame, giving what you need to know, or like what's going on here, what about these rings, what about these different races. And then Christopher Lee does this reading of it, who played Saruman. He played a
Mm-hmm.
bunch of other people obviously, but he like it's a great performance because it's like this, it's a sort of a poem that's meant to be, I think you could read it to yourself and it can work, but it's really great when it's performed because it was what an inscription on the one ring and all this stuff. So Tolkien, and that helps me with fantasy, sci-fi, that sort of thing. I believe for more like I remember really, and I haven't done it super recently, but Edgar Allan Poe was I liked him
Mm-hmm.
quite a bit, with the economy of words and the
Mm-hmm.
kind of
Really.
the creepy
Mm-hmm.
imagery that he would instill. I mean, it can get you real, especially at this time of year. Like he really gets you
Mm-hmm.
in that mode.
Yeah,
Um,
the Telltale Heart. Yeah,
yes,
wonderful.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just
There's
beautiful
just so
writing.
many.
Absolutely. If you just joined us, we're with Patrick McCorkle. He's an Oshkosh poet. I'm really happy to have you on the show, Patrick. Thanks again
Mhm.
for joining us today.
Sure.
Could you talk a bit about? We talked a bit about performative. We talked about the open mics. Does the fact of performing your poetry, does that impact your work? I mean, I like a lot of people that perform music say that when you do live open mics, that sort of enlivens their songwriting. Does the same thing happen with poets? Do you think, where you perform it live and you get this dimension of the audience? Does that affect your later work or what you might be inspired to do? Does that make sense?
Yes, no, I think it does. I think I definitely noticed that while the core of the work remains the same, I think sometimes with performing a poem, you might add some other verbal flourishes or the cadence changes, or
Mm-hmm.
because when you're the one now that you're reading it, the audience is you're kind of the main driver of the experience. When
Mm-hmm.
if I'm reading like Emily Dickinson or Lord Byron or Shakespeare or what have you, I control kind of the rate or maybe the how it's being read in my head. So the
Mm-hmm.
fact that when I'm performing it, I think it changes the flavor. I notice that sometimes I add words or subtract them to get like a better cadence. Or I think I'm a big fan of in writing sort of the repeated structure. But
Mm-hmm.
maybe the same sort of like I had that poem about the Oshkosh Public Library where I repeat kind of the same thing. But when I read it out loud, I think I abbreviated it slightly because I think it loses its effect when for me at least. So yeah, I think it the performing and the written aspect in a sense of technical sense, I think it changes somewhat of the content, the delivery, the cadence. As for what inspires me, I think at times, yes, like I noticed there was, I did a revision of a poem called The Voting Booth because I read the original and I was like, oh, I don't know, this seems a little clunky, or there's parts of it that I want to improve. So
Mm-hmm.
because I read it out loud, I made a new version, and I feel that is more authentic, or better, it better states what I was trying to convey. So I think a lot of times the performing aspect prompts revisions, prompts tightness, because I think maybe we're more forgiving when, okay, I'm reading this on my own time, or what have you, but if I'm performing it, it's sometimes brevity is sort of is maybe welcome. I don't know, at least that's the experience that I've had with performing poetry.
Mm-hmm. Yep. How would you say that? Let's talk about your biggest challenges you faced as a poet. Have you ever tried to write something and you've tried and tried and you can't get it right? Um,
Yeah, because I was doing for my fantasy novel. I tried to do, or I did like there's two sort of philosophical orders. It's sort of like a Jedi Sith situation where you have the preserve and the vicious, and I was trying to
mhm.
distill what is their philosophy in like a short creed like poem, or a creed
Mhm.
poem modeled after the Lord of the Rings, the ring verse. And that was it. Just I kept coming back to it where, oh, that I'm not, this isn't the right word, or this isn't the, like maybe it's a bit imbalanced in terms of syllables. So that took multiple revisions, multiple people offering feedback, reading it out loud. So I think the setback was it's sort of a difficult task to do, but it is
Mhm.
also, you just a lot of times writing, poetry, novel writing, any sort of written word or art, you find not only do you improve in your technique, but you figure out what your voice is. What are you trying to say? And I think
Right.
that that's just kind of the fact. Like sometimes it's just, hey, multiple, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 attempts. You just you go through what this idea may work, this word may work, maybe not, this device may work. So I think that's the challenge, is keeping to it, and not getting discouraged. Because it's like,
Mhm.
oh, I did this 4 times and this poem still isn't working.
Right.
But I usually, I think most of the time, I think I end up with a version that I'm satisfied with, or I simply table it, where we'll come back to that later. Maybe right now is not the moment for this work. So that's usually how I get past certain obstacles, is, repetition, different days, different eyes on it, what have you. Or it's okay. You can come back to it later. There's no expiration date, I guess.
Mhm. One thing I'm dealing with right now is I'm trying to record maybe 6 or 7 Christmas songs, just me and
Mm,
the guitar, and it's so because I never think that it's done. There's always something that I could do
mm-hmm,
better, and it's a really frustrating. But I'm hoping to
mm-hmm.
get at least 6 or 7 songs and I want to put them on Spotify.
Oh,
But it's part of that creative process that where do you know when you're I guess do you know when your work is perfect, or do you just kind of leave it hang out there with a few errors and that's okay? I mean, I really struggle with
yeah.
that. I struggle with that a lot.
Yeah, I think for for me, there's two kind of guidelines. I think I stumbled upon this Reddit comment where it said your revisions are revision, or you no longer need to revise when editing makes your work different, not better. So I was like, it's sort
Mm-hmm.
of it's sort of a vague comment, but
Yeah.
it sort of spoke true to me because when I'm like, okay, now it's simply I change this word or change this line, and the sentiment is different, but it's not necessarily better. It's not
Mm-hmm.
like it's as succinct it can be. It's as clear as it can be. There's another one too that I try to come by. With that, like perfection is the enemy of the good. Like there's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
works,
Yeah.
even poems that I've read where there's classics like Ozymandias, that poem about I think it was Peter Bryce Shelley wrote about like the Egyptian statue that just fades into nothing. Like it was this monument of great power and importance, and now thousands of years later, okay, like everything fades. But I mean,
Mm-hmm.
even there, you could make some suggestions. But I think it's probably a perfection's the enemy of the good. Once if I get people resonating with it, they might have quibbles, they might not maybe change. But I'm like, if I see that there's oh, this speaks to me, this makes sense. Like it's a very nuanced thing of like, okay, yeah, maybe I could tinker this again, but it is getting reaction. People are understanding what I'm saying. Maybe in the future, but yeah, then that's where you take like, okay, we're done with this for now. But it
Mm-hmm.
is very hard, and each piece is different. each
Mm-hmm.
each thing,
Yeah.
there's it's not all this. Yeah, so like with those other ones I meant, like the poems about my philosophies, that was like 4 or 5 times. With the
Mm-hmm.
voting booth, it was like 2 or 3. It's all different.
Mm-hmm. If you just joined us, we're with Patrick McCorkle on Poets Have Something to Say. Um, Glad to have you on here, Patrick. Thanks again
Hmm.
for joining us. Just a few minutes left. If this time goes fast here, do you have time for another poem?
Sure, yeah, sure. I certainly do. I think, um, because we've talked a lot about, kind of Tom Cannon, what he's done. I think that I'd like to do, and I just had it here, but like the poem where he was, uh, where he inspired me to do about, the color purple.
Oh, perfect.
Um,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
because that's more like the other one I wrote was satirical, and more. But yeah, this one is literally purple. It's inspired, it's in a fantasy context. So, but I think it still applies. So yeah, the title I guess would be purple. So
Okay.
purple is majesty, preemptive action, sweeping reaction, defying faction, correctness, gaining traction. Purple is rule through famine or feast, across west and east, of greatest and least, of man, plant, and beast. Purple is ruler, chosen for life, facing problems rife, avoiding killer's knife, defined by strife. Who will don the color? The existence maulers who cast all into squalor? The conservation scholars who are preservation brawlers? Through pages of thick tome, read to discover, read to uncover the possessor of purple and throne.
That's great. I love it.
Thanks.
Wonderful. We're with Patrick McCorkle here on Poets Have Something to Say. Um, I guess I wanted to ask you a bit about poetry, and can poetry spur political change? Do you think, or activism?
I think absolutely. I think as I brought up Lord of the Rings several times, and a big
Mm-hmm.
message of it is, I mean, there's a very strong environmentalist message in it. I mean, there's songs of the elves and the other creatures about kind of the natural world that they see and maybe what they're losing, and I think that's evoked a great sense of kind of loss, because Tolkien was writing at a time when the automobile was becoming more popular. There was a lot of industrialization in his area. So I think so in that, maybe that's a more indirect sense, but I think that definitely makes people think about it. What kind of world do they want? What kind of existence do they want? I think obviously there's a more kind of direct sort of poetry. Like I think Amanda Gorman had some at
Mm-hmm.
the that inauguration. I read her collection of poems. I mean, that was more like there's a clear political message. And I think because sometimes, I think it's no secret that America doesn't like to read books a lot, or there's a lot of
Mhm.
Americans who don't. And sometimes the asset of poetry is that it's brief, it's impactful, it's visual, and it can get people to really think about, this is an issue, this is something. I think it was My Papa's Waltz, a lot of the poems of the Harlem Renaissance that kind of stuck with me. I would argue that parts of the I Have a Dream speech are very poetic. You could
Yeah.
treat them as poems.
Yes.
So I would say absolutely, because the brevity, the conciseness, like the visual, the techniques like onomatopoeia or alliteration. So
Mhm.
absolutely, but it's like anything else. The timing's got to be there. The receptiveness to listen has to be there. But I think absolutely, there can be political, can be social justice, what have you.
Awesome. Do you have one more poem for us tonight?
Sure. Yeah, I think I could do. Because we've done a couple, and because a big part of my, again, environmentalism, a big part of my fantasy novel. I was sort of inspired by just because Wisconsin. It's more um, not just Oshkosh, but the whole state of Wisconsin has a strong environmentalist tradition. We had Earth
Hmm.
Day with Gaylord Nelson. We have
Yep.
Fighting Bob LaFollette.
Hmm.
We have a whole variety of environmentalist individuals. So I wrote this poem. Like I try to do something every year for Earth Day. So sometimes it's a um, it's both poetry and prose. Sometimes it's one or the other. But this poem, it would be, it's a tentative title, but it's, I guess it would be just, Sapiens. I'm not exactly sure of the title, but
Okay.
here it is. So, Sapiens murders fauna, humble to grand. No one protests. Sapiens murders flora, barren to lush. No one questions. Sapiens fractures rock, brittle to strong. No one travels. Sapiens pollutes water, droplets to waves. No one drinks. Sapiens taints air, thin to dense. No one breathes. When we cannot hunt, when we cannot farm, when we cannot travel, when we cannot drink, when we cannot breathe, we shall endure our supernova. Sapience shall cease. Before you stumble upon emerald earth bereft of trees, before you starve beside teal tributary bereft of fish, before you suffocate under cobalt canopy bereft of atmosphere, before you explode beneath scarlet sun bereft of mercy, protect the world forms, flora, fauna, rock, water, air, storm, because they are you, they are me, as one we are, as one we belong. Otherwise, sapience will cease to be.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And I would love to take that poem and post it on the Poet Laureate site. That's
Oh,
awesome. If you could
sure.
send that
Yeah, I
to me
could.
later, that'd be great. It's been wonderful. We're running out of time here. As I
Mm-hmm.
promised my listeners each and every show, I share one of my favorite pieces of poetry. It could be a part of a poem or a full poem. This one is My Heart Leaps Up by William Wordsworth, lived from
Mm-hmm.
1770 to 1850. Now, Patrick, you probably know this already, but he rallied for common speech within poems. And
Mm-hmm.
Wordsworth was famous for arguing against the poetic biases of the period. Wrote some of the
Mm-hmm.
most influential poetry in Western literature, including the most famous work, The Prelude, which is often considered to be maybe the crowning achievement of English Romanticism. So
Mm.
this is My Heart Leaps Up by William Wordsworth. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now. I'm a man. So be it when I grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. Thank you, Patrick McCorkle.
Thank you.
I appreciate. And by the way, what projects are you working on now? Can you reveal those?
Yeah, so I mentioned, there is it's for several years now. I've done a fantasy novel. It's quite long. It's like maybe 150,000 words. So, but I've
Mm-hmm.
been tweaking it and editing it. The maybe the tentative title be to define Amphomaria, which is Amphomaria is the name of the fantasy realm. It's kind of the struggle again between this preserve and vicious. Are they going to conserve? Or are they going to challenge, kind of the environment? So that's a theme along with others, good governance and what have you. I do my blog. It would be the primacy of politics. That's, the primacy, primacy of politics, all one thing. .blogspot.com, and I try to do a combination of editorials and poetry. So that's 5 to 8 posts a month. There's other like a book called "If You Can't Teach Politique." That's like a substitute teacher who, or sorry, it's a independent politician who's leading in the polls to be president, but then he does a bunch of nasty comments about teachers, and then as a campaign stunt says he'll become a substitute teacher. So that not as much poetry in that one, but maybe I could work it in there. And then there's a variety, kind of doing something for NaNoWriMo, kind of from the peasant perspective in my fantasy world, which that does have like poems and creeds and stuff in it, because, I'm just kind of thinking of the perspective of, like the peasant or the worker. They don't have a ton of time to read books. So maybe this is a catchy poem or a catchy a creed that they have. So those few projects are what I'm currently doing.
Outstanding. Again, thanks for being our guest, Oshkosh poet Patrick McCorkle. And you've been listening to Poets Have Something to Say. We'll be back next month with another fantastic guest. Thank you again, Patrick.
No, thank you.